review of turn of the 20th century foreign policy. We've already talked about in the previous film how before the turn of the 20th century, America was primarily an isolationist country. We were focused on the principles of the Monroe Doctrine, which told Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. would in turn stay out of Europe, and the Western Hemisphere would protect republics. We were special and not support the old monarchs of Europe. All these things we've already talked about in the previous slide. At the turn of the 20th century, we become more imperial. We start to look out with a policy of imperialism to becoming more involved in the world, and we ultimately become a world power. Alaska we purchased from Russia. Hawaii we obtained after deposing or removing the Queen from power. The Spanish-American War, we said, was a bit of a turning point. After the war started in Cuba, we declared war on Spain and helped the Cubans gain their own independence in 1898, but also in defeating the Spanish, we acquired the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico as territories. As far as China goes, we developed an open-door trade policy. We wanted to have all countries available to do business in China and to protect the territorial integrity of China. Big stick diplomacy, we talked about Teddy Roosevelt and our use of the U.S. military to help stage a revolution against Colombia to gain Panama and the rights to build the Panama Canal during the Roosevelt years. Followed by Taft with his dollar diplomacy in Latin America, the Spanish-speaking countries to our south. This one involved more investments, hence dollar. And then moral and missionary diplomacy with Wilson was more to support democracy and only democratic regimes, that was our right, moral responsibility, and our mission was to uphold democracy. That brought us to World War I. World War I was from 1914 with its outbreak up until 1918 with the armistice, and once America entered in 1917, after 3 years of neutrality, entering into Europe and involvement in World War I would be the final step to becoming a global power. This obviously broke away from the principles of the Monroe Doctrine, which had said we would stay out of Europe. So we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about World War I in this particular video. Starting with the trigger, World War I begins in 1914 with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. He was assassinated by a pan-Slavic nationalist, believed to be sponsored out of Serbia. So hence Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. There were alliances already in effect in Europe. So once Austria-Hungary went to war with Serbia, Serbia was backed by Russia. Russia had an alliance with France. France had an alliance with Great Britain, and so this brings the Allies. These are the Allies. Russia, France, and Great Britain are the primary ones. And then the Central Powers, the bad guys, in essence, in World War I that we were fighting against was Austria-Hungary and Germany. In the end, World War I is mostly associated with stalemate in France. This is where the trenches ended up developing. Not much movement throughout the course of the war, all the way up until the armistice along the Western Front. We talked about the United States remains neutral for 3 years. We don't actually enter until 1917. There's a strong feeling, a strong sentiment not to get involved, still based on the principles of the Monroe Doctrine, but we changed our mind over time. A lot of this was influenced by unrestricted German submarine warfare, otherwise known as the German U-boats, that were violating our freedom of the seas, violating our neutrality. So you see that a lot in the propaganda posters: defeat the Kaiser, the German Kaiser, his U-boats, help crush the menace of the seas. America must get involved to help save France, much as Joan of Arc had fought, and essentially referring to our involvement to help the Allies. Also in 1917, with Wilson's war message, he will declare that America must enter to make the world safe for democracy as our mission. And ultimately, the United States played a critical role by providing soldiers and materials that will help tip the balance of the war and to a Allied victory and a German defeat. In the post-World War I peace, Woodrow Wilson will travel to Europe to help participate in the peace treaty, and he will bring with him ideas, his 14 points, a plan to eliminate the causes of war, because World War I had been so horrible that we wanted and hoped, the world hoped, that this would be the end of war. So this was his plan, 14 points to eliminate the causes of war. One principle was self-determination. The idea was to redraw the boundary lines in Europe so that the people, the people in Europe, would feel more happy living in political boundaries that better match their ethnic group. So you can see this is the map of Europe before the war. There's Germany, there's the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then after the war is over, there's a number of new countries that are carved out of Eastern Europe, including Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, several of the Baltic nations, Austria and Hungary are divided, so they're trying to redraw political boundaries to better match ethnic groups. The Poles can live in Poland, the Slavs can live in Yugoslavia, and hopefully prevent another war. Freedom of the seas was another one of the ideas coming out of Wilson's 14 points to allow neutral countries to be respected on the high seas and prevent them from coming into the conflict, and provide better peace measures. The League of Nations was really important to Woodrow Wilson. This would be an association of nations that would work together to prevent war. They would prevent war by negotiations, but if there was one renegade nation, they would all act to isolate that nation and prevent another war from occurring. He very much wanted the United States to be a part of this league. He was proud of this part of the idea as a solution to another war, but as we'll talk about in a minute, the United States will reject, the Senate will not allow the United States to be a part of the league. And then finally, just of the four main ones that you need to be familiar with as part of Wilson's 14 points was the mandate system. This was a system whereby the Middle Eastern nations, such as Iraq, Syria, would be put under provisional government status. In the vision of Wilson, these people were not ready for self-government and needed the supervision of an allied power to look after them as they were developing. So Iraq was given as a mandate to the British, Syria, as you can see, given as a mandate to the French. And of course, this will be some of the origin of the anti-Western sentiment that will develop in that region. The Treaty of Versailles, unlike the 14 points, which was just Wilson's ideas for everlasting peace, this was the treaty that actually ended World War I. The French and the English dominated the idea that Germany must be punished. Wilson didn't want that to happen. He thought that would cause more problems. But the French and the English had dealt with Germany and German aggression a number of times, and so he insisted, the Treaty of Versailles insisted that Germany be punished. So these were some of the things we talked about that were provided in those provisions, including making Germany pay for the war. They are to accept the blame for all the destruction of the war. They lose a lot of their land. And of course, a lot of these things are things that Hitler later will reject and defy as he comes to power. They do include in the Treaty of Versailles the new national boundaries that we talked about with self-determination. And the world does create a League of Nations. However, it's weakened, partly because, as I mentioned, the United States will object, the U.S. Senate will object to any kind of marriage. We talked about this cartoon in class. This is Uncle Sam marrying into the League, which is attached to foreign entanglements. The idea that if we were part of an international organization, that we would have to go to war as a part of that peacekeeping measure, even if we didn't want to. That was the fear. So the U.S. Senate says no, we don't want to be a part of that. We want to make our own independent decisions for our own country. So this was the last thing we looked at in class. The treaty comes out, as this cartoon implies, kind of wounded, as the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, this is Henry Cabot Lodge we talked about, rejected membership in the League as part of the treaty. This concludes the review of World War I and the review of turn of the 20th century imperialist policies. Please review the slides and come back for the next film regarding the 1920s and the 1930s.